Paul believes that the promises to Israel are irrevocable, there's something supernatural. There's a sign about, you know, Jewish perdurance, and I resonate completely with Walker Percy on that, and St. Augustine, and Haman, actually, from the Book of Esther, though he observed it and drew terrible, you know, conclusions. But to me, that, you know, Simon's essay was extremely important in coming to grips with what that is.
Gentleman here in the light blue.
Hi. Let's see, there were a couple of very moving moments yesterday. One of them was Professor Hare and one of them was Professor Crenshaw, when they spoke quite personally. Professor Hare told a story about the document he had to sign at Calvin, and you said that you entered a community with pride and shame. So I wanted to join you in a way because I'm Jewish, and our morning prayers that I say every day recite the nations, and it's a source of shame for me. You know, that's it. You know, it's part of the game, and you accept a lot when you accept a tradition. So there's a kind of lack of sympathy I feel for kind of sophisticated rationalizations of stories about why it really isn't as bad as it looks, in a way that I felt throughout the conference about moves to kind of defend this stuff. Just a comment.
Where am I going? Far back. Oh, I'm sorry. You didn't need a response. Gentleman in the suit back here. Yes.
Just a couple brief comments in light of first Professor Curley's comment, then Professor Fales, to invite response. So in terms of the passage of where it seems to be, or at least on your interpretation, seems to be sounds conditional, that that God's promising the land, you know, assuming the Canaanites don't reform. I would agree with Professor Curley that I don't think that interpretation is warranted, but there is a sense in which there is a conditional, in a sense that if one follows Aquinas and a notion of God being eternal, that God knows that the Canaanites won't reform. So in other words, I think that counterfactually, if God thought the Canaanites would reform, then maybe he would not have promised the land to Israel. He might have promised them different land. So in that sense, there was a chance for the Canaanites to reform that God knew they wouldn't avail themselves of, hence made the promise.
I have no problem with that. What I said in my remarks is that the Bible, of course, doesn't have that, you know, Thomistic perspective on the problem. And so what the Bible does is continually throws up the matter that God oversees he providentially orders everything that happens, knows everything that's going to happen, but that we're completely free at the same time. And so we're responsible. I love Thomas's solution. And Thomas is trying to provide, you know, a solution to something that the Bible, you know, throws up there legitimately. But the Bible doesn't give us that, right? Thomas has to kind of corral all the biblical, you know, material and say, we can understand it all if we presume X.
And then in terms of Professor Fales' comment, real quickly, sorry, I think there's one somewhat relevant historical example. It's not a perfect analogy, but the nation of Poland. Now, they weren't dispossessed of their land, but the nation was politically destroyed several times, but the people endured through that. And I think we could also just construct a thought experiment where counterfactually, you know, time travel scenarios, you go back in time, Nazi Germany or the Japanese Empire won the Second World War and came and invaded and dispossessed the United States, that if Americans were living somewhere, there might be a nation, you know, holds the principles of our Constitution or whatnot, some sort of national identity. I think it's easy to imagine there being another Israel. And so I'm not sure if the uniqueness claim does hold up.
I'd like to, the gentleman in the far back row on the right there.
That's what they called it.
A presupposition of the problem we seem to be addressing is that the violence in the conquest is a kind of violence we're all too familiar with. So we've used the language genocide and ethnic cleansing. Apart from the fact that there's a kind of perverse logic to say, well, what happened in the Holocaust means we have to question the Jewish scriptures. Apart from that logic, when I read that text, I'm actually struck with the oddness of the violence, and it's so unfamiliar to me. For instance, both in Joshua, I think it's chapter 6, and in Leviticus 27, the harem is based upon the fact that these things are devoted and holy to the Lord. And that really hasn't come up, but I find so I'm wondering if the category that we're using is appropriate, and if in one sense it could even, and I'm not saying that this solves the problem of the violence, of course, but I'm just think how odd it would be, say, if when the United States invaded Iraq or Afghanistan, the president would come on and say, let's remember that even though we're going to have to kill innocent people, that they are devoted and holy to the Lord. And that just would seem to be odd. So I'm wondering if you can speak to the oddness of the violence and if that resituates the question at all.
It's really your domain. No, it's not my domain. I mentioned it this morning and said I read a bunch of commentators, and I could sort of speculate as to what it means, but I don't know what it means. I mean, you don't get it with all the cities that Joshua is presented as having destroyed, and sometimes everything is under the ban or devoted to destruction, sometimes only the people and not the livestock and so forth. So Gary, you're the Old Testament specialist. What does it mean? Tell me once for all, what does it mean?
First of all, the accent's on the first syllable. It's harem. Harem.
Okay. That helps.
Not harem, right? That's harem is a completely different, set of issues. Morally problematic in its own way, but for different reasons. One of the things that people don't realize about harem is that, first of all, it was a common practice in the ancient Near East, so it's not unique to Israel. We have the Moabite stele, we have the word elsewhere. So it is the way in which war could be practiced. But what's striking about it, and actually it contributes in its own way to your thesis this morning, Nick, though I wouldn't accept all that you argued, but not my deal to weigh in on you here. We'll wait for later to do
That's
that.
legitimate.
But it would contribute to the non-historical nature because, well, I'll just give an analogy. One of the reasons scholars have suggested that Jonah is not to be understood as a historical narrative is not so much the whale. That's not really the huge miracle in the story. The huge miracle is that the whole city of Assyria repents with 3 words from the, few words from the prophet's mouth. That's simply unbelievable. No prophet in the Bible has, such a record of success. I always, when I teach that class here at Notre Dame, where we have considerable, sadly, undergraduate drinking problem, I say it would be like, Father Poorman, our, person who oversees these matters, walking into Dillon Hall and saying, there'll be no drinking this fall at Notre Dame, and he walks out the other door, and then all fall, no one drinks. How imaginable is that? But I mention that because harem actually, if you compare the way in which 20th century wars were waged, the carpet bombing of Dresden, the bombing of Hiroshima or Nagasaki, actually Joshua doesn't look so bad. I've been very, unhappy over the course of the conference of the way in which, ancient Israel is primitive and we're not. But, the man who dropped the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, think of how many infants and children were wiped out. Think of, President Obama as every American president, is empowered to do the same thing any moment to the Soviet Union. That, there's nothing in Joshua or Judges that's comparable, not even remotely comparable. Adorno said, the history of progress is the movement from the slingshot to the atom bomb. It's something to ponder as people get worked up about the book of Joshua. But harem is not something that you could use as a general mode of prosecuting war, and wasn't used as such because someone mentioned the show Rome, the HBO series.